Ah, yes, Civil War reenactments. One of the great traditions of being an American is either participating in a Civil War reenactment or observing one. You see how broadly realistic this one appears to be. We have our Union soldiers and we have our mounted Confederate soldiers. And then we see the other prime factor of evidence for the Civil War in the United States, the many military cemeteries. And to be quite frank, these seem to be the most prominent forms of evidence that we have in the United States that a civil war occurred. However, we're looking much more broadly than that. We're looking at the Reset War of 1847, or more specifically, a broad range of conflicts that occurred across the world from 1847 to 1870. Of course, if you're a frequent watcher of this channel, you know how we feel about years and what the actual dating system says the real year is. But regardless, we're looking to answer the question on what was the primary source of the orphans for the orphan trains. I was asked that question many times after doing the orphan trains video, and I thought that it's also time to cover the aspect of conflict in the three phases of changing a society, which include conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. We look at our 5 eras theory timeline, and we're looking at the contemporary age. We're looking at how we transitioned from the previous age, which we call the Tartarian age on this channel, but it could have many different names, to our contemporary age. We have 3 different theories on when the last reset occurred. And again, this is all dependent on a dating system, which may or may not be accurate, or may be completely fraudulent. We just don't know. But we suspect that the reset occurred either in 1850, 1800, or 1750. In today's exploration, we're going to see an abundance of evidence that indicate that it may have occurred in or around 1850. Again, going off of the dating system that we were given and the points of reference that we were given. Now, we're making some broad-based assumptions that these are correct, the dating systems are correct, and the reference systems are correct. There's another video on this channel that you can watch where we talk about the unreliability of the dating system and how we're really dependent upon the good word of many governments and many institutions, of course the ones that preceded our current governments, because we're questioning the trust of governments, and we know that we don't need to question the trust of our current governments. They have many checks and balances in place. But previous governments that our current governments tell us are not reliable. The Reset War, 1847 to 1870. Now, all of these conflicts that we're going to be looking at were conflicts that occurred in the mainstream account. These are all historical conflicts. And we're going to look at each of these conflicts and how they're related. And surprisingly enough, many of these conflicts are related back to the United States Civil War, which is very strange. What does this really tell us about the state of affairs in the land in 1847 to 1870? We start with the United States Civil War, which seems to be the primary event that was the catalyst for many other events. We're told that this was a great struggle against slavery, and that this occurred 1861 to 1865, the North against the South. While that was occurring, we also had ongoing Native American wars, where the United States government attempted to subdue all the Native American tribes, and this was an ongoing conflict. There were conflicts that occurred during the Civil War, after the Civil War, before the Civil War. There was the Mexican War in 1846 to 1848, where a U.S. expeditionary force went to Mexico and defeated it. There was the Walker War, where U.S. filibuster went down to Nicaragua and took it over, a guy by the name of William Walker, and he was defeated by an army led by Costa Rica, of all nations. Then there were the Irish raids that occurred after the Civil War. Bizarre. Finally, we go to South America. There was conflict in Chile with the Revolution of 1851. There was the Pereira Revolt in Brazil, 1848 to 1849. And then there was constant conflict in Colombia, 1851 to 1885. So we've already looked at 2 entire continents, North and South America, what we're supposedly told is the New World, and we see that they are rife with conflict during this particular time. What exactly was going on during the 19th century, or the period of time that we're told is the 19th century? We've only looked at two continents, and we've seen that they've already been overrun with conflict. What about Australia and New Zealand? Well, in New Zealand we had the Maori Wars, and in Australia we had the Aboriginal Wars, which were somewhat similar in their ongoing nature to the Native American conflicts in North America. So it's interesting. We have expeditionary conflicts occurring where nations project military power to faraway lands, which is supposedly supposed to be very difficult and require great logistics. And then we also have internal insurrection. every type of conflict occurring during the time when technology and communications were supposedly far more limited than they were to this day. Well, let's take a look at another continent. What about Africa? Well, in Africa, we had the scramble for Africa and new imperialism, which supposedly occurred from 1833 to 1914. The brutal and bloody colonialism, which European nations tried to impose their will by carving up pieces of Africa for their own exploitation. Another form of mercantilism, if you will, where the people were either enslaved or they were exploited. No doubt that many examples of this occurred. All right, well, let's try Europe. Well, in Europe, we had the revolutions of 1848 to 1849, apparently a massive social uprising against the ruling order, which supposedly the monarchy defeated, and then the monarchy imposed many of these reforms, bizarrely enough. The United Kingdom, which I say is separate from Europe, had the Chartist revolt or revolution in 1848, where a group of middle-class people tried to revolt. And then there were other wars occurring across Europe, and then even the First and Second Schleswig Wars, which involved the Nordic nations and Germany, oddly enough. Russia was involved in the Crimean War in 1853 and 1856, which was another large-scale conflict facing the United Kingdom and France, almost a precursor to many other conflicts to come in the future. And then there was the ongoing Caucasian War, where the Russians were supposedly trying to destroy and defeat many different groups of people who had been forgotten to history. And this had been an ongoing war for many decades prior to this period. And yet, when we open up to this period, this war is ongoing. So we see all of this conflict. And to be fair, there is far more detail that I'm covering here. We're just looking at these conflicts in totality. Well, let's go to Asia proper. We have the Indian Rebellion, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, 1847 to 1848. China, we have vast conflict. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, which supposedly killed 20 to 30 million people. The Second Opium War, where we had numerous nations, once again, United Kingdom, France, I'm using modern names that say simple, supported by the United States, 1856 to 1860. In Japan, we had the Japanese Civil War, 1850 to 1864, and then a few short years after that, the Meiji Restoration, where the Tokugawa shogunate was overwhelmed and they had to return to the emperor's authority. These are all historically documented conflicts, and you can see that every single continent in the world between the years of 1847 and 1870 were rife with conflict. And not just regional conflicts. These were external conflicts. These were expeditionary conflicts. Was this really what we're told, or was this the Reset War from 1847 to 1870? The agenda with which to destroy the remnant enclaves of the previous civilization that did not go with the reset. Now, there's a lot of evidence that we can consider that shows that this is indeed what occurred. We have all these conflicts that occurred in a short period of time. Consider the analogy of all the city fires that we have, and we look at how if you change one of the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why, you can suddenly change the how. Now imagine if the W, the when, on these conflicts was changed. Imagine if all these conflicts occurred within a much shorter period, say 5 to 10 years. Would we consider this a world war? Consider how many of the leaders in Europe who were connected with the revolution of 1848 to 1849 actually ended up becoming significant Union Army officers in the United States during the United States Civil War. 8 out of 10 pictured here became very prominent Union Army officers. No, none served with the Confederacy, they all served with the Union. And you can see them in the Union Army uniforms. It's an intriguing premise, and what's this really saying? They failed in the revolution, supposedly in Europe, although the monarchies that defeated them, including some of the most fanatical monarchs, ended up imposing many of these reforms, and we're told they just had no choice to do it. It's a fascinating dichotomy. We also look at the casualties from 1800 to 1899, and of course we see in the early 19th century the Napoleonic Wars supposedly produced the most casualties, but are they even counting any of the casualties that occurred in China? 20 to 30 million would take you well off this chart, or are they just saying that they're spread out? Ascertaining the number of casualties is always very difficult. And whenever you look up a single conflict, say the United States Civil War, depending on the day and the source, you'll get a vast disparity in the number of casualties reported. And of course, they'll try telling you, well, we're reevaluating the number of killed, wounded, died of wounds, sick, injured, etc. And it's a very interesting consideration because they're supposed to be historians. Well, let's look at some pictures of these conflicts, and we'll start with the Crimean War. And we look at this picture and we see what appears to be some sort of expeditionary force, although these are some of the earliest pictures that were supposedly taken, and we have to consider the detail that we see with the land and these ships. what's exactly going on here? Does this really look like an organized military expedition? Now, of course, the historical account will tell us, well, the United Kingdom hadn't participated in a war for some time, and they were simply out of practice. It had been since the Napoleonic Wars and Wellington's great victory at Waterloo that the United Kingdom's great military machine had gotten to exercise itself. Look at this intriguing building. Sort of a pyramid building that looks like it is supposed to serve as both a church. I wonder, did they just affix a cross on top of it, or was it always there? Supposedly this is from the Crimea. Although one wonders on the authenticity first and foremost of these pictures. I guess you can actually see clouds on it, which is always a unique aspect with these older pictures. And what's the actual date on it? And the location, because the reality is anybody can associate anything with any image that they want to, and that's something that we always keep in mind on this channel. And it's important to always ask questions and not be solidified into a particular belief, because if we look at how all systems operate, here's another picture of what appears to be port operations, and here perhaps we can see maybe a little bit more of an example of an initial military expedition in the Crimean War. And we see some armed sailing ships in the background, which look like they have cannons in them. They're cramped awfully close together, but perhaps that was the realities of the port. We can understand that. It looks like we see some sort of very rudimentary rail checks right in front there, where they're offloading what appears to be the supplies in the crates. There's many different movies that try to give an interpretation as to what happened during the Crimean War, and they're quite fascinating in how they seem to depict a historical narrative. One of the most legendary aspects of the Crimean War is the charge of the Light Brigade. And here, looking at these uniformed British soldiers, we see a vast array of uniforms, and yet does this really look practicable? It's the same questions that we have when we look at the United States Civil War. Yet, oddly enough, there's also something similar about this disparity of uniforms. Is this really one nation's military? Or is this some other military that was actually engaged in an expeditionary operation? Many of these photos give clues that there could be something else entirely going on. And yet, for many people to even ask these questions, they find it very offensive and absurd. Now, if these conflicts did occur as we're told, I don't mean to question the bravery or the valor of these veterans. But we have to ask questions about this because then we see images like this. Look at how well built up that building is, or that post is in the background. And we have, of course, cannons, and then the very well-stacked cannonballs. They look like they're in position to conduct some sort of siege or to bombard the fort. It doesn't look like the cannons are actually in position to defend the fort, but who really knows? We always get so many conflicting accounts with many of these so-called pictures that we have. And here we have more of the classic vanilla sky where you can't see a cloud, and you certainly can't see what's on the distant horizon. I wonder why. Yes, people say I wonder a lot, but if you're not wondering a lot, then you're just taking all these pictures at face value, and you're never really going to get anywhere. This is an interesting one because we see what's supposedly a defensive position, a very well built-up redoubt. We're told that the United States Civil War is really the first modern war where they experienced trench warfare towards the end of it, and yet this looks a lot like trench warfare to me, but I don't know, maybe they just didn't count it as trench warfare because there weren't an extensive series of trenches. Ask a military historian and they'll tell you 10 different things depending on when you ask them and what conflict you're asking them. And no, I don't say that as a derogatory remark towards military historians. I'm merely saying that to consider the fact that there are many different perspectives, even in the mainstream, about what actually happened in these conflicts. Look at how many times the account of World War II has changed in terms of what actually happened, and that was a conflict that only occurred about 80 years ago. Here we see more soldiers, and they look like they're uniformed a little bit more uniformly, if you'll excuse the pun. Yet, again, we always get the same feeling that we do when we look at American soldiers in the U.S. Civil War. And again, these are British soldiers, or so we're told. Who really knows? It seems like they're just having a grand old time, and, war is just really a great old vacation. Although if you watch many of those movies about the Crimean War from whatever time frame in the previous decades, it gives you the impression it really wasn't a very fun conflict. And then you also have accounts that medical services were very poor. And you look at a picture like this, and again, you get this impression of the attempt of logistics. Why do all these cannonballs look so old, as though they've been sitting there for decades? Well, it was just very dry and arid, and the wind blew some dust on them, and they just left them there. I wonder who actually piled all those cannonballs there. It just looks like a pile of junk, as though something has hit the land, and people are simply responding to it. You also see what looks to be a steam stack in one of the ships in the background. Now, yes, we're told they had that technology at the time, and the Industrial Revolution had occurred, of course. Yet there's just so many anomalies in this picture, to include even the structure in the background. And this is supposedly a picture of combat from the Crimean War. Although this is a bit of a rendering, it appears to be mixed with a little bit of a real-life photograph. It's hard to tell. And that's another ambiguity with these photos. And we always talk about or lament the fact that we don't have actual combat photos from the United States Civil War or the Crimean War. Yet, again, this gives me the nature that this is potentially trench warfare, if this is indeed how it happened, although who knows if this is how it happened. If you're in a military expedition and you're attempting to conquer a land, are you really just going to dig in and sit around and do trench warfare? Or are you going to use maneuver warfare? Oh well. Military historians can correct me in the comments. I'm sure they'll enjoy it. Let's go to Japan and the Meiji Restoration. Now, the interesting thing about Japan was that it was under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, and if you've ever read James Clavell, he details it very well, albeit with alternate names, in the book Shogun, about how Japan had fallen under the rule of the shogun, or military dictator, instead of the emperor. Japan is such an interesting place because, to this day, it has a very strong culture and a strong sense of identity, and we see beautiful architecture. And this is typically the kind of architecture that we associate with Japan, these sort of castles, whether it's Osaka Castle or Tokyo or Yedo. This is Commodore Perry, and he led the U.S. military expedition to open Japan to the world. Very fine photograph. He looks like a very squared away and stern U.S. naval officer. I like how he has one button unbuttoned, and it looks like he has another button not quite buttoned all the way. I don't know, maybe he was just a comfortable kind of guy. He looks like he was very easygoing, very jovial. You'd think, though, that if he was taking a professional photograph, and given the amount of time that they put into professional photographs, he would make sure that all his buttons were buttoned and he would look professional and stern. But perhaps because he had the name Perry, because Perry is a traditional U.S. military name going back to the War of 1812, another interesting conflict in and of itself, he didn't have to have his uniform fixed up properly for his picture. And here we see this opening of Japan. There was no real contact between the United States and Japan, at least no formal diplomatic relations until this Perry expedition occurred, again in the 1850s. And Perry apparently forced Japan to accept him, and they just let him in there, even though, according to historical accounts, Japan was very distrustful and reluctant to allow foreigners in their land. Can't imagine why they would feel that way. And for some reason, they just decided to respect this ebullient and very brash U.S. naval officer who put on such a great display that apparently it somehow intimidated the Japanese. Very interesting account. And these are some of the earlier pictures that we see of Japan from the 1860s and 1870s. And again, we see a very well built out and developed infrastructure, many power lines, tracks, and well built out buildings. Not exactly what we'd expect to see for the 1860s, 1870s in Japan. But again, there could be something off on the dating on the photo. It could be from the early 20th century. It's just strange, and again, we have many conflicting accounts from this, and we consider this account of these conflicts that we're looking at. We wonder, is this an accurate photo, or is this something else that's trying to give us a different impression of what Japan was? Or is this really what Japan looked like in the 1860s and 1870s? Well, if this is really what Japan looked like, we have a very conflicting account. And again, another picture of what we're told is supposed to be part of one of the imperial areas in Japan after the emperor had retaken power from the Tokugawa shogunate. And there's many movies made about that. Perhaps the most recent one is The Last Samurai, which is supposedly from that time frame, although it's quite an interesting movie, especially when you consider some of the scenes from it. But look at that structure there, that archway. There are parts of it that have a very different construction appeal to it, and there's other aspects to it that don't really show what they're really doing. So I'm trying to wonder, what exactly is this showing? Now, this is the steam engine that Commodore Perry apparently brought along with him. Now, imagine loading the steam engine on and off a sailing ship, even a steam-driven one, because Commodore Perry was a big proponent of steam-driven ships. Look at the date on that. 1883? Or is that an I? Come see our amazing steam engine from 1883. It's from the future. Was Commodore Perry a time traveler too? Or is this an old date? What depiction is this miniature steam engine even from? Because that's what we're told that it is. Is this an American depiction? A Japanese depiction? Something else entirely? Is that really an I? Well, if you're interested in the dating system, check out our dating video on the channel. The Taiping Rebellion. Lots of conflict in China during the 19th century. There was an internal conflict between the Qin dynasty and the Taiping Rebellion. Now, details of this conflict seem to be a little difficult to come by, especially if you're not actually in China, but apparently this was a violent internal conflict that involved large armies. Naturally, there's no pictures of it, we only have depictions like this. So if anybody speaks Chinese or is familiar with Sino history from this period of time, I'll admit that I haven't studied it. I have some bare bones knowledge on what I'm told on the historical account is, so I welcome comments. Yet it seems like it was a very brutal conflict, and some accounts say that 20 up to nearly 30 million Chinese died in this conflict. It sounds far more brutal than the United States Civil War was, which, even at the highest end, was 1 million Americans that had died. So what was really going on during this time frame? It's very difficult to decipher if these conflicts were what we're told they were, or, again, were these conflicts really an expeditionary force that was going about destroying the enclaves, the remnants of the previous civilization. When you factor in even the historical account that there's only 23 years dispersing these conflicts, and many of them occurred during the same time frame, you're given the impression that it seems like there's a lot of holdout enclaves. There are settlements with walls around them that are under siege. And why would that come up as a recurring theme? And it seems to be a recurring theme in many of these conflicts. I'm simply trying to interpret what data that we have. It's very difficult to get a clear picture. And that's why this kind of research can be very ambiguous and, to be honest, frustrating at times. We just want some clear answers. We would like some solid answers, some solid evidence that tells us what's really going on. Okay, if this was a civil war in China, we understand it's a terrible thing, war. And yet it seems as though the entire land during this time frame was just overwhelmed with war, internal and external conflict. Why is it now it seems as though everyone, at least in the Western world and modern media sources, are perfectly content to have all their attention focused on one regional conflict, which on the surface is only really between two nations? Yet during this time frame, it seems as though we have more conflict than we did in World War I and World War II combined. A lot of alternative researchers will point back to what was called the 7 Years' War, or the French-Indian War, depending where it was, 1756 to 1763, and state that that was World War Zero. And here's one of the few pictures that we have of the revolutions of 1848, and this was the Chartist movement in the United Kingdom. Very interesting. This seems like a photo, although does it really seem like a photo? We've looked at it before on this channel. See a very large compound in the background with some impressive buildings and a large smokestack. We see many individuals wearing top hats, and supposedly this is a meeting of the Chartists, the group of people that wanted more rights, especially for the middle and lower classes, or so we're told, and that supposedly this was an offshoot of the social upheaval that was occurring in Europe at 1848, even though this is in the United Kingdom. Now, the revolutions of 1848 are something you will find virtually no pictures of, and in my research I could not really find any pictures, and these were a series of uprisings that occurred against the aristocratic governments across many nations of Europe, Austria, Denmark, and again we have the same kind of pictures. It looks like there are settlements that are under siege or being assaulted. What exactly is going on here? We also have a similar feeling or theme that we have in the United States Civil War, and of course many people will be saying, well, it's in the same time frame, they wore the same uniforms, they used the same tactics. What's interesting though is the vast disparity in casualties that you get in many of these conflicts, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But look at this and look at some of these uniforms. Even though this is in Europe, there is a very distinct feeling of, and I'm not trying to offend anybody, I'm just calling what I see. It almost feels like this is something else from the United States Civil War. If you change those flags to red, white, and blue and put stars on them in the field, you have to wonder, is this really depicting this kind of conflict? Is this really what was going on? I mean, yes, these are all just drawn and painted pictures. Anybody could do these pictures. They could be from any time frame. They could say anything. Yet this is what's being depicted and shown to us. And again, more uprisings and more cities. Again, and again. Whether it's pictures, whether it's drawn pictures or paintings, or some combination using some means that we don't fully understand, we see a plethora of evidence that shows similar uniforms, similar tactics, and similar types of operations, which seems to involve either sieges or assaults on cities or settlements, occurring all across the land. That's the key theme that's very difficult to neglect when you consider all these conflicts. It's strange enough that they all occurred within such a compressed time frame, according to the mainstream historical account from 1850 to 1870 or 1848 to 1870, or whatever years you want to go by. But then not trusting when the years actually occurred and seeing our little miniature steam engine before, it makes us call into question the actual dates and the years and what was really going on during this time frame. If you could insert a year or two into a time frame, or if you could simply report events occurring on different years, how difficult could you make it to track the actual course of true historical events? Now, of course, people will say that this is absurd, that would never happen, there's too many overlapping authorities, and there's too much collaboration. Yet here, when you look at this picture, again, I see uniforms that look very similar to what the Union Army wore in the United States Civil War. But of course, you can see whose flags are back there, and you know this is not depicted in the United States. But something about it has a similar feeling to it. It's also intriguing when you consider the fact that so many foreign nations sent officers that served in the United States Civil War, and they were already wearing similar uniforms in the years beforehand. Perhaps I'm simply reading too much into it, yet why in all these photos do these all look so much the same? And this is about the only picture we'll get of the Caucasian War in Russia, which is merely a painted picture where we see the type of conflict that was going on there. It was a long-running, brutal conflict and supposedly had denigrated to the status of a genocidal war. Although, looking at the overall scope of these conflicts, you have to question if this was a genocidal war across all the lands. Because when we look at how the casualties have vast disparities in them, and I'll give an example. In the United States Civil War, we're told anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million Americans died. And then in the conflict that occurred in Canada immediately following that, we're told that only 37 people died when this Irish nationalist force from the United States invaded Canada and had to be defeated by the Canadian militia. Yes, this really happened, 1866 to 1871. I guess President Grant didn't opt to stop this or was too busy with other matters. The Opium War in China is quite intriguing as well, and we do have some photos from that because that's another foreign expedition. So while there was this large uprising against the legitimate Chinese government at the time, 1850 to 1864, there was also this foreign expedition. Now, there had been an earlier Opium War. This was the second one, where the United Kingdom and France, and then with some help from the United States, were involved in China. This is really interesting because you can look at the historical accounts, you can do all your appropriate research, and yet you have to accept the fact that there are overlapping conflicts occurring. There are foreign forces that are involved in a nation, while that nation is trying to suppress insurgents or rebels within its own borders. So every type of conflict, every type of destruction, every type of death that we can imagine, what does this really tell us about what's going on in the 19th century? And I think this is some of the most substantial evidence that we can have. Consider this Opium War where we have the picture here of the well-uniformed, trained-led British Army fighting with the Chinese forces. And then, of course, we see, look at the architecture. Now, again, this is a painted picture, so who knows about the veracity of it, and this could be dramatized. Yet our mainstream account tells us that these events all really happened within close proximity of each other on the date line. It's another example of the more questions we ask and the more research that we do, if we actually ask questions about it and consider it within the realm of logistical limitations, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And here we actually have a photo showing some destruction and some death from supposedly the Opium War, although who knows? Was it the Opium War in China? Was it part of this overall greater United States Civil War? Or was it really this worldwide expeditionary force that was all operating on the same orders, on the same agenda, to destroy the remnants of the enclave of the previous civilization? Because there's no shortage of cemeteries, and there's no shortage of memories or records from these conflicts. And here's the other aspect of it. A lot of alternative researchers will tell you that you have to completely disregard history if you're going to be successful or effective in this kind of research. My approach, though, has been Consider the fact that what if what they're telling us does have a lot of half-truths or even quarter-truths in it? Now, what do I mean by that? Think on the fact that if someone could show you a little bit of evidence that something's true, they can't show you evidence that it's completely true, but they can at least show you one thing that something's true. Here's an example. There's a cemetery. There's names on it. There's ranks on it. There's dates on it. This is a cemetery from the United States Civil War. This is from the Battle of Vicksburg. This is from the Battle of Shiloh. Or in China, this is from the Battle of Beijing or whatever. And then on top of all that, we're told that we have global temperature change that occurred very significantly in the 1840s to the 1850s with the ending of the Little Ice Age. Now, who knows if this is accurate data from the time frame, but again, we're told by our mainstream accounts that this is very accurate and that there was an extreme temperature change at the time with the Little Ice Age finally ending in the mid-19th century. Strangely enough, that overlaps with this period of conflict that we were just looking at from 1847 to 1870. And we have pictures like this, which show what was still going on in places across Europe, the United Kingdom, the United States, where areas were very cold and they were iced over for a grand period of time. Now, granted, you could still go there during winter potentially and see this happening, and I've had some viewers tell me, well, there's just extreme weather factors that can hit places at certain times, and yes, this is all true. But at the same time, this is what our official account tells us happened, that this little ice age finally came to an end, and this time frame just happened to overlap with this period of intense conflict, really a world war if you want to think about it, and something far more brutal than a world war. Oh, and let's also bring up the 1859 Carrington event. The 1859 Carrington event, supposedly there were fluctuations from the sun that caused massive disruptions in telegraph communications. Yet, oddly enough, when you try to verify this event in local media sources, looking at newspapers from the time, whether it's from the United States or Europe, it becomes very difficult to verify that this event truly occurred. Now, if someone out there has some sort of access or some sort of ability to look at different sources and give indications from the time frame that the Carrington event truly occurred, then by all means, share in the comments. It's just strange, though, to consider that. And now let's go back and look at some of these pictures from the time frame of these intense conflicts. So we've had vast climate change supposedly occurring. We've had the Carrington event that hasn't occurred yet at the time of this photo. And we have all this conflict. And yet, here's what a cathedral in Baltimore, Maryland looked like in 1856. Very beautiful, very well built out. I like the brick there, the nice beautiful red brick. And look at that light right there. Of course, we'll just be told that it's a gas light and they had to light it every night. Whether it's a gas light or not is irrelevant. Look at the construction that we have within these buildings and the layout of the street and the sidewalk. Some of it looks like it's very beautiful and brand new, and other parts look very old. Then we go to Paris, and we see how things looked there in 1857. We see very well built out buildings, and we see an amazing variety in architecture. But we have to remember there's all these conflicts that were going on. There was this massive social uprising that occurred in 1848 across all of Europe. And there was supposedly climate change and everything else going on. And yet, I mean, granted, this is another one of those questionable photos because you don't see the detail in the sky so well. Yet we know and believe that there are buildings like this. There was infrastructure like this. And then the Great Eastern at London's Millwall Iron Works and the River Thames in 1857. Again, while the United Kingdom was busy with all of its overseas expeditions and everything else that it was doing. Tell me, does this really look like this ship is under construction, or does it look like this ship is being salvaged? Strangely enough, at how old that large chain over there looks. And I love how we always have the individuals with top hats that are always just sort of hanging around, supervising, or, I don't know, maybe just getting in the picture. It almost looks like there's some sort of survey going on here, and they're all just posing. As though these are explorers who had just arrived in this land and they want to see what they have. And then let's not forget the other great achievements of France. Supposedly they built this incredible viaduct in 1861 to 1863. After the Carrington event, after all these social upheavals and all this conflict, they managed to do all this. It's when you start to take these overlapping factors into account that we're told from the official historical narrative. That alone, regardless of whatever you think about the actual years or dates, that's where you have to start asking some very hard questions. Because the more you look at this, the more detail that you look at it within, you start to have more questions. Again, looking back at Paris, and we see what a beautiful modern city it looks like in 1857. Fairy tale towers everywhere you look. Well, it's Cathedral of Notre Dame, so it was always well built out, and it was amazing what they can do. Yes, of course. And people will tell you it was all because of the Industrial Revolution, and we could achieve great things in the Industrial Revolution. Well, tell me, was the Cathedral of Notre Dame built before or after the Industrial Revolution? I'll just leave it at that. I like the road there where it looks like there's a lot of mud or dirt on it, but I don't know, maybe that was just horse and carts riding across. Look how beautiful and modern those bridges look, though, across the river. Very intriguing and very well in depth. So going back to the 5 eras theory, I think we have a lot of evidence that the reset occurred in or around 1850, maybe 5-10 years before or 5 to 10 years after. Who knows for sure? And I'm basing this on the amount of conflict that we have from 1847 to 1870. I'm basing this on the fact that they tell us there was a major climate shift that may have occurred for a variety of reasons in the years leading up to this. And I'm also basing this on the Carrington event. These events all seem to correspond. Now, could it be possible these are all just false flags or misleading information that we're given? Absolutely. There's a reason why I don't tie myself too hard to these beliefs. We are doing alternative research, which is based on theory and conjecture. We have to ask questions and we have to keep exploring. That is how we're going to find the true answers to many of these mysteries. And these are going to continue to be mysteries no matter what we do. Now consider, I've gone back and I've actually looked at my major theories for what's the reason for the existence of Tartaria in the old world. And oftentimes I go to theory 1, we've experienced 5 ages or eras of time. But the more I look into things like this, sometimes I wonder if it's theory 3. Are we living in a simulation? Why do we have so many inconsistencies with our timelines and so many reality glitches? And depending on who you talk to, different people have experienced different realities. And they really believe that they have experienced different realities. It's not something that people are making up. Now, of course, you can just sit there and pretend that everything is just fine, and it's just because people have fallacies in their memory. But, of course, these are the same people that will be told that other fallacies or things that conflict are true because certain authority figures tell them that that's the way things should be. And they will not question it. And, of course, you can see these real-life examples every day. I don't have to tell you examples of people simply adhering to authority. Just go out and walk around and you'll see it. Or is it possible we're living in a dream, our own or another? You know, I always keep these theories on the table because when you look at all this conflicting information and you see just this one historical account of a time frame from 1847 to 1870, 23 years, it's a lot of questions that come up. And I think this is one of the things that shows why we have all these questions. Now, going back to the original point of this exploration, the origin of the orphans, I have some theories to explain where these orphans came from. Now, I believe there were 2 different phases of the orphan trains. There was the initial phase in 1850 to 1870 and a subsequent phase that occurred all the way as far as the 1930s and the 1940s. And here are the major theories. 1, the Reset War destroyed remaining enclaves of last civilization. So what remained of Tartaria that didn't go along with the reset? It had to be destroyed. Prisoners were taken en masse from these conflicts going on across the lands. And many of them were taken to either asylums or prisoner of war camps, where many died. Orphans from across the land were shipped to New York City, and there they were distributed across the United States because for whatever reason, the plan that they had indicated the United States was going to be settled from people from across the world. Now, going back to the orphan trains, people say that in the pictures they only see one particular type of appearance of human being, and that's very true. However, just because there's a lack of pictures of other types of human beings doesn't mean that they weren't part of the orphan trains as well. For example, just because the media doesn't talk about a certain conflict going on in a certain part of the world doesn't mean there's not a conflict going on, right? In any event, it's hard to say exactly what the reality of the situation was. But I suspect that the reason that they do this is just to keep people questioning and just to sow division, as because what you display in pictures can always be questioned, and it can always cause people to question their status in life and stay more concerned about questioning their trust in each other as opposed to questioning trust in, we'll just say, institutions perhaps they're not supposed to. Finally, what's the repopulation aspect of this? Consider if we had a reset and a worldwide conflict, we know that many human beings died. We're under the impression, and this is reinforced by the fact, that labor was required, especially in certain areas of the world, and they used child labor quite extensively. The orphan trains initially were designed to provide child labor, and it seems they were provided to induce diaspora and dysphoria amongst the people. There's also the fact that there was a vast population influx in the United States through San Francisco, as we talk about how the Transcontinental Railroad was supposedly constructed by two different ethnic groups of people working from the East and the West and meeting in the middle. Well, what's the truth and the reality to it? We just don't know. We have all these hints and all these clues, and this is why we have to keep doing this exploration. I hope today's exploration provided a theory, though, for where these orphans may have come from. And could they have grown additional people in test tubes using alchemical processes that would have provided more of a population, or the incubator babies? Absolutely. And I believe that was a subsequent phase to the plan when they required more people and more labor in certain areas that were depopulated from all this conflict and everything else that was going on as part of the reset. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. We'll be exploring Kirkbride, American Asylums, finishing the reset in the 1800s. In yesterday's video, we looked at photos set during the 1850s, and we postulated a theory about the reset occurring around 1850. But how did they get that reset to continue? How did they make it successful? Going back to the 5 eras theory, again considering the top timeline potentially being the most accurate, although, again in full disclosure, I don't know. There could be years that we're not aware of. How long did the reset actually take? Did it last a year? Did it last 5 years, 10 years, 100 years? It's all open for debate. We just don't know. I don't know. This presentation is based on theory and conjecture, attempting to provide some explanations for many clues that we see in photos, historical narratives, the conflicts and the anomalies that we observe in both. I believe that the Kirkbride Plan and the use of asylums in the United States provides a very important clue for what very likely transpired after the last reset, and how those who are in control and make genuine policy decisions had a plan to ensure that the reset would be successful. So let's see what the mainstream tells us about the Kirkbride Plan. The Kirkbride Plan was a system of mental asylum design advocated by American psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride in the mid-19th century. The asylums built in the Kirkbride design, often referred to as Kirkbride buildings, or simply Kirkbrides, were constructed during the mid to late 19th century in the United States, so right in that questionable time frame. The structural features of the hospitals, as designated by Kirkbride, were contingent on his theories regarding the healing of the mentally ill, in which environment and exposure to natural light and air circulation were crucial. So this sounds very benign, and it sounds very altruistic. The hospitals built according to the Kirkbride Plan would adopt various architectural styles, but had in common the bat-wing style floor plan, housing numerous wings that sprawl outward from the center. The first hospital designed under the Kirkbride Plan was the Trenton State Hospital in Trenton, New Jersey, constructed in 1948. Throughout the remainder of the 19th century, numerous psychiatric hospitals were designed under the Kirkbride Plan across the United States. By the 20th century, popularity of the design had waned, largely due to the economic pressures of maintaining the immense facilities, as well as contestation of Kirkbride's theories amongst the medical community. So wait a minute. There were economic pressures in maintaining the immense facilities, but apparently there were no economic pressures in constructing them. Fascinating. Again, another marvel of the 19th century. Numerous Kirkbride structures still exist, of course they do, though many have been demolished or partially demolished and repurposed. Yes, of course, on that account too. At least 30 of the original Kirkbride buildings have been registered with the National Register of Historic Places in the United States, either directly or through their location on hospital campuses or in historic districts. So let's look at the basis in philosophy, as that's one of the key clues that we have with the establishment of state mental hospitals in the U.S. is partly due to reformer Dorothea Dix, who testified to the New Jersey legislature in 1844 vividly describing the state's treatment of lunatics. They were being housed in county jails, private homes, and the basements of public buildings. Dix's effort led to the construction of the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum, the first complete asylum built on the Kirkbride plan. Thomas Story Kirkbride, 1809 to 1883, a psychiatrist from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, developed his requirements of asylum design based on a philosophy of moral treatment and environmental determinism. The typical floor plan, with long rambling wings arranged in echelons, staggered so each connected wing receives sunlight and fresh air, was meant to promote privacy and comfort for patients. The building form itself was meant to have a curative effect. Special apparatus for the care of lunacy, whose grounds should be highly improved and tastefully ornamented. The idea of institutionalization was thus central to Kirkbride's plan for effectively treating the insane. So you get an idea of what the summary is, and of course it all sounds very benign, and there's a picture of Mr. Kirkbride right there, or should I say a drawing, as Johnny Depp would say, of Thomas Story Kirkbride, the creator of the Kirkbride plan. But the fundamentals of it are that we have this standard template of designs for buildings, one featured right here, and laying out the buildings this way is going to help us treat the mentally ill. Okay, on the surface, this all sounds very benign, and this sounds very altruistic. We legitimately want to help people. Although we have interesting conflicting accounts of what the state of morality in the 19th century really was, this sounds like it's a good idea. This sounds like it's something there to benefit the people. Well, let's look into it a little further. How exactly was one considered insane or committed to an asylum in the 19th century? Let's take a look. All right, so let's take a look at reasons for admission to asylums, 1864 to 1889. Intemperance and business trouble, very serious. Kicked in the head by a horse, serious problem then. Hereditary predisposition, ill treatment by husband, hysteria, marriage of son. Well, that's always a good one to send somebody right off the edge. We've made movies about that. Yes. Medicine to prevent conception. Novel reading, overaction of the mind, periodical fits, political excitement, politics in general. Well, as you read through this, you get all these amazing little details, and basically you get the feeling that they could just confine you to an asylum for really any reason. Let's look at some more. Egotism, the war, time of life. Does that mean that you've been around too long, you're too old, or you've experienced some rough events? Hard to say. Vicious vices. Women trouble. That's right, don't have any issues with your relationships, that'll get you confined. Superstition, snuff eating for 2 years as opposed to snuff eating for 1 year. Spinal irritation, gathering in the head, hard study, rumor of husband murder as opposed to actual husband murder. Okay, so I guess if your husband's really murdered, then it's okay to be hysterical over it, although I'm sure they could find other reasons. Salvation Army. Dissipation of the nerves. Fell from horse in war. You have to wonder, do they have a catch-all in this? Sort of like the very aptly named Uniform Code of Military Justice in the United States military. That's the catch-all where if they can't find something else that they can charge you with, that they can get you on. And in the United States military, that is called conduct unbecoming an officer, conduct unbecoming a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine. Basically, if you go against the grain or somebody doesn't like you, there's something they can charge you with. And I think I found it here. I believe it's this one right here. Bad company. So if somebody considers you bad company, that is, they don't like you, they could have you confined to a mental asylum in the 19th century. Now, a lot of people will say that this all-inclusive list was partially a joke, but it is rooted in realism. And we don't really understand what the full process was for having people confined to asylums. Now, you'll see in some of the more mainstream channels on YouTube, they do a very objective review of asylums, to their credit. And they talk about a lot of the controversy. And one of the stories you'll hear of is of an unfortunate woman whose husband had her confined to an asylum because he simply wanted her out of the way. But you can find stories of many different people in all different facets of life and all different social classes at that who were just suddenly confined to asylums. There are too many stories to go around, and when you look at this all inclusive list, which also has the catch all reason, it seems obvious that anybody could be confined to an asylum for any reason in this time frame. Very suspicious indeed. Well, let's take a look at what these buildings looked like. So let's begin by looking at the first so-called Kirkbride Asylum, the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum. And yes, you see their batwing layout, as they call it, and you have all these rooms in separate wings where they could all get sun, at least that's what they were told, and I suppose pragmatically these rooms would get sun, and then of course they all come off a central facility. And then, of course, you see the adjoining image right here. I wonder if this dome was mandatory or was this just something that was optional on these facilities, if they did indeed build them. And I know a recurring question that comes up is okay, well, if these buildings were already here and they were inherited, what was their original function? Well, that's something we really don't know because we don't have any idea of what the society or the civilization before us was truly like. We can speculate, and a lot of speculations I've heard and some really good theories, and I think a lot of them come from John Levi. I've heard him say them a lot, is that potentially these were large hotels or resorts. And you can see why it matches that kind of layout where you have all these rooms off a main hallway and then you have a main meeting area. These are where your meeting rooms are. Or perhaps there was some other function. Maybe it was some sort of government building where people came from across the land to meet in more isolated areas where they could get away from everything, and they would stay in these rooms and then they would meet in the central meeting rooms, and that's where they would discuss local politics. Who knows? It's speculation, but nevertheless, it is clear these buildings are laid out the same in some facets, although there are subtle differences, and let's take a look at some more. So this is the Institute of the Pennsylvania Hospital, and supposedly this is the one that Kirkbride made into his first full prototype, after the New Jersey one, of course, in 1859. So they say that it was in existence in 1841, and then they expanded it, and Kirkbride, utilizing his brilliant theories, made this wonderful building. And of course, optional dome is installed. Amazing building, though. A couple little pillars, and then, the central hall facility area. And then the other interesting thing is, why have multiple floors if you're dealing with people that are confined to an asylum? I mean, I don't know. To me, that always seemed a little counterproductive. Would it make more sense if this was a hotel or an administration building? Yes. Does it make less sense to me if it's an asylum to try to help people that are unstable? It makes a lot less sense in that case. I also included this interior photo so you can just see how amazing this building was on the inside. And look at this architecture here. Again, you have amazing arches and just beauty and serenity, and of course that goes in line with the stated purpose of it. Well, we need to make these buildings really nice for these people that we send there. But remember, they need to get lots of sunlight. It's good for them. But if the building had a different purpose, perhaps that makes more sense as to why it's beautiful and why it gets a lot of sunlight. Just some things to think about. Could be off base. This is the facility in Oregon, and this is supposedly one of the oldest facilities on the West Coast, founded in 1862, although they do admit that this building was supposedly built in 1883. Just to note that Oregon became a state in 1859, and they already had a facility of some sort. It was probably likely this building in existence in 1862 because, even though it would just become a state and people were still settling it, you needed to make sure that you had your asylum. You couldn't go without an asylum anywhere. And just wait till you see where this story's going. Taunton State Hospital in Massachusetts, 1854. Now, this is the old admin building, and this is no longer standing. This is allegedly a photo from the 1980s, although who knows for sure. Amazing, beautiful dome on it, and look at the big window there. It's just remarkable. I mean, all this effort and all this detail for a mental asylum in 1854, or whenever they would say they actually built it. And what do we have here? Looks like this could be some sort of power source potentially, or were they just putting a really nice tall device on the top of it for decorative purposes? Maybe that was to help people as they were walking around outside. Hey, look at the tall tower. It's really pretty. It relaxes me. You do have to wonder when you look at all these buildings. I don't know. I mean, it is beautiful. Not going to deny that. St. Elizabeth Hospital opened in 1855 under the name Government Hospital for the Insane. And this is supposedly in the Washington, D.C. area, I believe. And this has more of a castle layout to the top of it. Although you do see the familiar layout with the central facility and then, of course, the wings going off from it that do have the exposure to sunlight. But again, that just seems to be a little bit too convenient in terms of the purpose being to allow the patients to recover because, well, let's just say there's a lot of derogatory information and accounts that are associated with mental asylums, and not just in the United States. And as I mentioned that, you might be asking, well, why is the focus on the United States? Why was the Kirkbride plan in the United States? Because it seems clear that the plan for how they were going to divide the land, with dividing and designating the nations, involved setting up the United States as eventually being the one and only hyper-military power in the world. Yes, it seems as though that was set up even back in this time, where you had people that settled from all different lands, they were bought in the United States, but the narrative that they were trying to spin at that time involved people coming there and having to accept the fact that they would see these large, amazing, beautiful buildings where there shouldn't be any, in a story that they were told in a land that was not settled and not developed in any way, shape, or form. And yet, just seeing these photos, you get a different story. So you have to wonder if that all fell into the original purpose for the Kirkbride plan, conditioning the population to think what they are supposed to think. Kalamazoo Regional Psychiatric Hospital officially opened on 29 August 1859. This is in Michigan. And here we have more of a brick building. Nice tower. Not exactly sure what this is, if this is a different tower. You know, you got a bit of a mix of a castle with the old manor look, as I like to call it, from the 19th century. But again, very beautiful building, lots of detail with the brick and interesting designs on it. You know, who knows when it was originally built or what its original purpose was. Again, multiple floors. So looking at a couple different ones, and I've tried to select ones that I haven't seen on other channels or I haven't seen featured on anything with mental asylums, just to give you a fresh perspective. Bryce Hospital opened in 1861 in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. So look at this beautiful building, and of course we might say, well, this at least looks like it should be something in traditional Southern format, but interesting that they opened this up in 1861, right at the start of the Civil War, and Alabama, as we know the official history tells us, is one of the Confederate states. So did they just continue to operate this and continue abiding by the Kirkbride plan, or did they care about the war and was it used for war purposes? Well, I really couldn't find anything on the history on it, but look at that. It does include the optional dome with the beautiful windows. So, you know, it's just like the same huge tower that I saw in the Soldiers Asylum in Milwaukee at the old Soldiers Home. You need to have this big tower where you can walk up to the top of and look out at the windows and get this amazing panoramic view. Because that's something else that will apparently help people who are mentally ill, right? Wait a minute. View at State Hospital, Cherokee, Iowa? What? Look at this. Look at the tower on this. What a beautiful building this is. You have the fairy tale turrets, and this is unbelievable. And the reason I say this is Cherokee, Iowa is isolated. Even to this day, it's, I hate to say it, but it's not in a densely populated area. You could say it's in the middle of nowhere in BFI. Anyway. I mean, just to show you exactly where it is, okay? This is western Iowa. The nearest cities are Sioux City, Sioux Falls, and Mankato. Mankato was featured a lot in Little House on the Prairie. But this is nowhere near Des Moines. This is nowhere near the large cities. I mean, this is a really isolated section of Iowa. There is not a dense population here. I mean, how far away did they have to get? We need to look more into this Cherokee Hospital in Iowa. What's this look like? Is this still there today? So let's explore this facility, the Cherokee Mental Health Institute, and you can see where it's marked, and the closest major city is Sioux City, which is probably at least 40 miles away, if not more. I mean, it's just shocking. You're really here in the middle of nowhere, Iowa. Well, let's get a look, and let's transition to our aerial imagery. Nice little town, and oh yes, there it is, that same layout. Now, supposedly this one was built in 1902, and it was the last of the major asylums constructed in Iowa, but we'll get to that story when we do. For right now, let's take a look at this. I mean, wow. This thing is huge. And it's just in a small Iowa town in the middle of nowhere. And it just stands out. Let's see, can we drop the man? Looks like we can. Wow. It's still there. Incredible. In all its glory. What a facility. You know, and I'm reminded of early explorations of places like St. Coletta. I mean, just look at this construction. Unbelievable. They had the resources and the time to build something like this in the middle of isolated Iowa in 1902, before they had the state highway system well developed, well before the interstates, not too many decades after just establishing the Transcontinental Railroad. They just built this large facility out here. This just defies explanation. It looks like the once beautiful tower that they had on it's been removed. That probably stood out a little bit too much as imposing questions when people saw that. How far does this really go anyway? Is there another building back here? Oh, yes, there is. Looks like it's obscured, but another brick building and another part of the compound. You know, it's just like St. Coletta. It just keeps going and going and going. You have to wonder how many people were really, I'll just go ahead and use the term, interred here. And another brick building. How much capacity did these things need? How many people did they have here? I mean, they tell us, you know, the largest ones took maybe 1,000, but you could see it was a capacity for so much more. It just defies explanation. All right, so I know what you're thinking. Aurelian, you just need to rein it in a little bit. You're probably going a little too far with this because, okay, so there were these amazing asylums that were built in the middle of nowhere. It goes along with that same old story. Yes, there may have been some people who were sent there against their will. You know, we occasionally falsely convict someone and send them to prison wrongfully. It happens, we know about it. But why do we have such a negative connotation with asylums? Well, I'll pull up this little article that summarizes it pretty nicely. Yes, it's an urban legend, but urban legends don't just start on their own. There's always something behind them. The Central State Hospital. The building once known as Central State was originally built in 1873 as the home for juvenile delinquents at Lakeland. And just for context, we're in Louisville, Kentucky. The original buildings were adjacent to the woodlands that are now known as E.P. Tom Sawyer Park in Anchorage, Kentucky. So it's a very beautiful area. You can walk through there today. Due to the abundant overcrowding, and that's a recurring theme you'll get when it comes to asylums, especially in the 19th century. Abundant overcrowding. Why? At the Eastern and Western asylums, the building at Lakeland was renamed and given a new purpose: the care and treatment of patients with psychological disorders. During the mid-1920s, allegations of abuse began to arise. Even the director, Dr. Preuss's sanity was put into question. In 1930, they began using cold showers, insulin, lobotomies, and electroshock therapy to cure patients. Reports of massive overcrowding began in the early 1940s, as wards originally designed to have a capacity of 1,600 were found to be holding well over 2,400. So again, I go back to that question, how many people were really interred in these facilities? In 1943, the state grand jury found the asylum committing people that were neither insane nor psychotic. Shocking. Very shocking. Many of the older buildings were labeled as fire traps due to their age and their deterioration. In 1953, Dr. A.M. Lyons was indicted for malfeasance and mismanagement. There were also reports of over 20 separate fires and murders among the wards and multiple escapes during his term as director. In the early 1960s, the state of Kentucky began funding of a $3 million plan to modernize the hospital in 1963. 3 new buildings were opened for use. During the 1970s, various changes went into effect. The hospital became privatized and patients that were not mentally ill were released. 1981 saw the biggest change in the hospital's history. It became an acute psychiatric hospital, and in 1986, all patients in administration moved into a more modern 192-bed facility. All of the original buildings are gone now. The original hospital, sadly, was bulldozed in 1996. The only remnants are memories For years, teens and young adults trespassed into the old hospital upon hearing tales of patients being mistreated and abused, because it goes along with the haunted theme that we have with every single asylum across the world. Have the mournful souls that died at Central State remained at the only home most of them ever knew, filled with pain and anguish and death, just as they were in life. Quite a facility. Beautiful, but then we have this account of all these terrifying things happening there. Well, we didn't find out that the United States conducted experiments on human beings against their will, right? We didn't thoroughly account for that. That's not known and admitted to by the mainstream, is it? Yes, it is. Well, let's take a look at Iowa, since we want to go to the bottom of that Cherokee facility. I mean, this was just Louisville in Kentucky. Maybe this was just one facility that had something like this happen at it. It was an isolated incident, right? Well, let's look at this little account for all these facilities in Iowa, and there's 5 that they point out. And the first one they talk about is the Poor Farm, the Johnson County Poor Farm, built in 1855. And really what they say is that hard work and fresh air. So they put people to work. Often the very poorest citizens were also residents of these establishments. And so they lived at county poor farms and did farm chores as they were able. So in other words, it gives you the impression that there was a shortage of labor, and people who didn't agree with what was going on were sent there to work. And then you get some of the other facilities in Iowa. Look at this one, Independent State Hospital. Remember, this is a state with a minimal population that during the Civil War sent over 10% of its entire population to fight in the U.S. Civil War, or the War of the Rebellion as they called it. And here you go, you get this theme. A growing need for mental health facilities in Iowa after the Civil War caused the Iowa legislature to put aside money to build an additional hospital for the insane. The only facility in the state was in Mount Pleasant at the time, and it was overcrowded. Of course it was. Independent State Hospital opened in 1873. What a beauty that is. Wow. In the middle of Iowa in 1873. As they were building the Iowa State Capitol, no less. What a surprise. Does this story get worse? Clarinda was the home of Iowa's 3rd insane asylum. It opened in 1888 and accepted only male patients because the female wing wasn't complete. The 500,000 square foot building has a Gothic facade that retains the original architectural integrity. And they still use it today. And there you can see it. Wow. Ah, yes, the Cherokee Mental Health Institute, the one we already took a look at. Look at, there's that amazing, beautiful tower. Maybe it wasn't so optional after all. When the state of Iowa needed a 4th asylum to relieve overcrowding in the other facilities, the town of Cherokee lobbied diligently for this building. The legislature granted their wish, and the hospital opened in 1902. In the first 2 weeks it was open, over 500 patients arrived by train. At its peak, there were more than 1,000 patients living there. We have to wonder, is that all that was living there, given that immense amount of space? This was a working farm, and residents helped to produce the food they needed. Chickens, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and a large garden. Sustain itself. So we see this recurring theme that these facilities were isolated, they were off the grid, and it's the same story for asylums across the United States, and whatever they called them, whether they were asylums for the mentally ill, asylums for soldiers, asylums for children. We had asylums for everything, it seems. What was really going on at these asylums? What was really the intention behind the Kirkbride plan? Those are questions we have to ask. So what can we say in conclusion about the Kirkbride plan? Well, let's recount the facts. It's a fact that many of these buildings are still standing today. Therefore, you can visit them and you can verify their existence, and you'd be surprised at how many there really are. The documented facilities from the Kirkbride plan do not even begin to scratch the surface of the number of facilities and their widespread use from the 19th through the 20th century. It is true that in the mid to the late 20th century, it seems as though the political wind shifted and many of the facilities were shut down. And the United States completed its transition from interring people in mental asylums to prisons, which is where many people find themselves today. Those are all facts. It's also a fact that there is a very colored history with many of the facilities of the Kirkbride plan. They were not so benign and benevolent as their intention was. There are many reports and accounts of the patients suffering. And then we also have to wonder, were these internment camps blended over to extermination camps, because the line from internment camp to extermination camp is non-existent at best. How many people were really interred in these locations? How many people died there, and how many people suffered there? Those are important questions. But finally, what do I think are the theorized goals of the actual Kirkbride plan? What were the real goals of it? Since the last thing they wanted to do was help people, or have people who were actually ill be there. And our mainstream even admits this, that many people were in these facilities who were not mentally ill at all. The first goal, under the actual goals of the Kirkbride plan, was to ensure the population adhered to the reset, that people accepted the society, history, culture, and authority, that their beliefs were controlled. This was not simple authoritarianism. This was totalitarianism. The population had to accept it. And I speculated in an earlier video that there were enclaves, there were pockets of survivors from the reset that were still out and spread across the land. They either had to be exterminated or they had to be confined. Another goal would be to utilize and explain the presence of isolated large facilities that remained after the reset. You have all these incredible facilities that are out in the middle of nowhere. How exactly do you explain it? And if you can't explain it, how difficult would it be to tear them down? And we know for a fact that there are many large facilities, such as the City Hall in Philadelphia, that they just simply couldn't tear down because they lacked the resources to tear down the buildings. So this would be a good way that you could solve both problems. You can now utilize these facilities, and since they're already isolated, it's a place where you can send people away from the main population. And that's goal 3, function as an internment camp far away from populated areas. Any survivors you find that you don't kill, and any people who resist accepting the new order can be sent to these facilities. And finally, and most insidiously, you can experiment with methods of individual and group control and influencing the mind. And it seems that's exactly what happened at these facilities. It's also a fact that we know that the United States conducted experiments on human beings against their will. That is well documented. And there are many stories that come with these facilities. Mental asylums do not have good connotations with them. And you have to ask yourself, why? Now, is this all a dark tale that's told to make us feel down? No. The most important thing is that we have awareness. If we have awareness of what happened and what could happen, then we can preclude it from happening in the future. We understand the true past, so we can live well in the present, and we can build a better future. And that is the real goal of these explorations. Welcome, and thank you for joining me for today's exploration into orphan trains completing the reset. The objective of today's exploration is to consider the role the orphan trains played in the last reset. New viewers of the channel may not be familiar with the 5 eras theory. The channel has several theories for the existence of the Old World and Tartaria, and this is one of the theories that we consider the most plausible, the 5 eras theory. Breaking down the entirety of human existence into 5 distinct eras that were separated by hard resets. The Golden Age comprising the first 3 eras, and then the Tartarian Age, or the age that preceded ours, whatever you want to call it, the civilization that we believe was across all the lands that came before us. Then we had a hard reset, and the year on that hard reset we debate. Was it 1850, 1800, and 1750? And that brought us into our contemporary age, or the current time frame that we have many unique and creative names for, such as the age of plastic, the age of disposability, and the age of many different alluring historical narratives. What we're looking at here, though, is the time frame immediately following 1850, which is when we believe the last reset occurred. And we're going to look specifically at how that reset was implemented. It looks like there were 3 distinct approaches that were used: conflict, assimilation, indoctrination, and typically in that chronological order. And in fact, even to this day, we see conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. The 19th century was rife with conflict, to include the United States Civil War, the Crimean War, and yet you can look and see many other conflicts. After conflict, which seemed to be targeting the remnants of the enclave population, the survivors of the previous civilization, we had assimilation, and that was where everyone found their proper roles in this new civilization after the reset. And then finally you had indoctrination. And indoctrination was ensuring that people had the proper thoughts and that they would never question what had happened. We have many pictures from this time frame that tend to pose more questions than they answer, as though there was some sort of strange, massive expedition that was going on across all the lands to pacify what remained of a population. Now, we're told that these are legitimate conflicts, and the historical narrative tells us there was a civil war going on in the United States, there was the Crimean War going on, and so many other conflicts that you can look up yourself that completely dot the landscape of the 19th century, or the timescape as it were as well. It's an intriguing consideration, and yet we see other signs of it that show that there may be much more going on than we're aware in the historical narrative. The United States Civil War is often examined because of the conflicting accounts that we have in what occurred in the Civil War. Oftentimes we have pictures that don't match the narrative that we're given, or create more questions than they answer. For example, we're told time and time again that the United States military, or the Union, was segregated during the Civil War, and yet you see many different pictures that paint a different narrative. Now, were these pictures that were taken for purposes of displaying the political message at that time? And could they have been supporting the war effort as we were told in the historical narrative? Of course. However, there's just too many of them to simply ignore, and we have to wonder if there was something much greater going on, and that the nature of the conflict, and there's no doubt there was a very significant conflict that occurred, and not just in the United States and in the United States Civil War, but in all these conflicts across all the lands. We have to wonder what the true objective of the conflict is. And one of the channel's primary theories is that this conflict was targeting the remnants of the enclave population that had survived the last reset. People that they knew that were not going to go along with the reset and not drop what the truth was in favor of a new historical narrative. We have strange pictures like this that are supposedly from the United States Civil War, where we see large rabbles of people. We'll be told that this is some sort of formation for a militia. But when you look at this image, does this really give you the inclination that this is a militia? Or is there something else going on here? And we have the strange individual there with the top hat. This doesn't appear to be a military formation. It's very odd. You could have any kind of explanation for this photo. Is this a group of refugees going somewhere? Is this a group of people that are being moved from point A to point B against their will? None of the faces look particularly happy. This doesn't look like a group of people that are a militia, or they're going off to defend their homeland against some existential threat. We also think about the role that Asylums played in the assimilation and indoctrination aspect of the conflict, assimilation and indoctrination. Earlier, the channel theorized the goals of the Kirkbride Plan, which was the plan behind asylums in the United States, but there were asylums across all the lands to ensure the population adhered to the reset. This was their way to ensure that people properly assimilated and they were indoctrinated. And if they were not, they were sent to the asylum, where they would live out their lives. It also supported the dual purpose of being able to explain the presence of isolated large facilities that didn't make sense. We even had special soldier asylums for soldiers who may have served in this conflict of suppressing the enclaves that remained from the previous civilization, and they were unwilling to accept the narrative that they were given after the conflicts were completed. So they had special asylums to send them off as well too. Now again, this is a theory. This could well be that it's just the historical narrative as we're told. But there's far too much evidence and far too many conflicts in the story to simply ignore it. And now we have to look at how the orphan trains played a role in this. We're given many accounts that there were just simply roving bands of children, especially in New York City. And we're told that this was because there were many children born out of wedlock. This is an interesting account because at the same time we're also told that culture in the United States was very different, that religion played a large role and morality played a role within the family. We have to wonder when we see these kind of images, did these children really come from out of wedlock? Or were they the survivors, the remaining children of the families whose parents were killed in the conflict? Those families that were the final survivors of the previous civilization who refused to recognize the authority of the new civilization after the reset. It's a very intriguing premise, and we have to wonder, was that their story? We consider the concepts of diaspora and dysphoria. Diaspora being the concept of spreading a people from their homeland and removing their identity, and dysphoria, taking away their sense of adventure in life. Children without homes. It's a very noble aspiration. It's very altruistic. We're told that these children were simply compiled in New York City and that there were so many of them in roving bands that they didn't have their parents and they were simply orphans and they needed to be cared for. They needed to have families. So you can look up the grand plan that we had in our official historical narrative that there was simply a religious figure, a young minister named Charles Loring Brace, who became concerned with the plight of these street children and enacted a plan to where they were going to be transferred to states and families where they could be given wondrous families. Interestingly enough, the numbers that we have for how many were victims of this plan, or perhaps we should say those who benefited from the plan, because that's what we'll be told by the historical narrative, we have to wonder, what was the true number? We're told it was 250,000. But how many was it really? Numbers are always something that seems to be up for debate, and even our casualty figures from the United States Civil War seems to be a very fluid number. That varies depending on what we look at. Of course, we discuss the altruistic nature of this endeavor, and it seems like it's something benevolent and would serve a good purpose. Although it should be noted that the transportation of children away from their parents is something that's occurred time and time again. For example, in World War II during the Blitz of London, where we have children that were taken away from their parents and sent away, ostensibly for their safety. In fact, the film Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, the Wardrobe begins in this manner, where the children are taken away to escape the bombing. It's a very mainstream image that reminds us of what happened in the past. It also reminds us that this approach continues, this approach of seeming to want to separate families. Is it something that merely occurs because of events beyond our control? Or is it something much more insidious? Part of a planned, controlled narrative in which we attempt to attack every aspect of an individual's identity. And we start with the most basic, with the family. We look at the images and the concept of the orphan train going back to the United States, and we're told that its success depended on the altruistic nature, the generosity of the farmers, and the mercantilists that these children were being taken to. It's an interesting prospect in the fact that these children were supposedly part of roving bands in New York City, or that they were simply overwhelming the system there, and they needed to be moved to a place to where they could be used. The other aspect, we're told, is that there were vast labor shortages across the Midwest and in other states. And we see these images which show this being a very successful program and everyone benefited from it. The families or the businesses looking to put children to work, and the children were given a place to live, potentially a family, and 3 square meals a day, and a roof over their head. But was it really that benevolent? Was that really the intention behind it? We see these images, and we remember how images can tell a different narrative than what the story that we're given is. We have to wonder, is there something much more insidious behind all this? The question I have is, if there was such a labor shortage across these states, and we'll take a look at a map here in a moment, then why did they need children to fill these labor shortages? Even if your only goal was simply to provide labor and provide efficient labor, it would certainly make more sense to have adults. And I'm told by numerous viewers that there were many people who simply had to work or they would die. And that's why there were so many laborers to do construction jobs. Well, what about agriculture? Isn't it also important to provide food to feed people? They seem to overlook that little fact that they claim there were labor shortages in the Midwest. Labor shortages that can only be filled by children. Interestingly enough, and not just in the farm fields, but in the mills and the plants and whatever baseline manufacturing that we had at that time. A lot of these images are considered shocking today. Of course, there's also the more benign aspect of growing up on a farm and you're part of a family and you work on a farm. Is it really terrifying labor, or are you just doing your chores and you're learning responsibility? It's true. However, you look at this from a grander perspective and you realize this goes beyond the simple concepts of child labor. You see that what's really happening is these children did have families. And we also find instances where there were multiple phases of the orphan trains. The initial orphan trains that ran in 1850 through 1870 seemed to be taking care of the kids that no longer had any parents. And after that, we saw repeat occurrences of the orphan trains, where there are many accounts that one of the parents were still alive. Whether it was the mother or the father, it doesn't matter. And the account we're given is that the mother or father, for some reason, was incapacitated, and therefore the children had to be taken and sent to another family. And if you think about this, and if you think about why this effort would continue, this is where the true insidious nature of the orphan trains is revealed. This is how we destroy a people from establishing an identity and their own individuality. And you'll find plenty of accounts, especially on public broadcasting service or public television, where they talk about how benign and altruistic the orphan trains were and how effective they were. They even have people that they interview who were actual members of the orphan trains, or those who rode the orphan trains, as they euphemistically say, and that they ended up with a good family, that they felt that they benefited from the situation. Even more interesting is that most of the people they interview claim that one of their birth parents were still alive, and yet for various reasons they had to leave. They were alcoholic, or they were suffering from some sort of depression, or there was some other reason. A lot of times, though, when you try to look up the accounts, there was no reason given for why the children were taken from their parents. And remember, this was in the later decades, 1850 to 1870. It seems pretty clear there were a lot of children who simply didn't have parents. But then after that, they seem to repeat the concept of the orphan train as a means of taking children from their parents. It's a theme that appears and reappears in our historical narrative, and it's a disturbing theme because it does contribute to the concepts of diaspora and dysphoria. It prevents people from forming the ability to establish their own identity, and it makes them even more reliant on indoctrination. And if you think about this, you see how effective this is as a tool of indoctrination. Because until these children were given families, they were also kept together. And we think about many of the great schools that children were taken to. We also think about some of the schools that we looked at in our earlier explorations, such as St. Coletta. And we have to wonder if they had a different purpose. Everything, we're told, started in New York, and specifically New York City. This is where all these orphans seemed to be in a vast number. Why just New York City? Or was it because New York City was simply the collection point for all of them? If you think about it, it's a major port, and towards the end of the Civil War and the other conflicts, it would make sense to have the children as orphans go there. And then they were transported to these states, namely the Midwest states, to supposedly work on the farm where there was a shortage of labor. But none of the people who were looking for jobs decided to go out to the Midwest. They just wanted to work as construction workers. I'm being a little facetious, but I'm also being serious at the same time, because this doesn't make any sense. It also doesn't make any sense from the aspect as to why the Midwest would seem underpopulated. We're told it's because it was settled, but then at the same time we see all these towns and all these cities that seem to come up from nowhere. Each of the states of the Midwest also has their own account of the orphan trains, and Of course, it's always supporting the narrative that this was a benevolent effort, that this was very altruistic, and this helped the children. And yes, I keep using that word altruistic because if we think about the grander aim of this, and the fact that we're told to think a certain way about this, we have to wonder, what's the true objective? And why was this something that was turned to again and again? Especially when we have numerous accounts of families who still had a parent that seemed to be perfectly capable of taking care of their children. This is also reflected more recently in the mainstream. There was a movie from 1979 called The Orphan Train, which you can still watch today, featured Glenn Close, and it was also featured on the very popular 1990s TV show, I'm not knocking it, Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, a show that was carried entirely by the charisma of Jane Seymour. And the episode, in fact, was called The Orphan Train, where a group of orphans showed up in Colorado. No, not one of the states, but everything seemed to happen in Colorado if you ever saw that show. And Dr. Quinn decides to team up with the local reverend, and they're going to raise the children, and there goes the plot. Of course, it's resolved within 60 minutes, like many other TV shows. The real point behind this is the fact that you have this concept of the orphan train remaining within the memory of the United States. And yet it's pushed again that this was a very benevolent effort, that we were legitimately trying to help these children. And yet you see other accounts that conflict with that. And I'll start with the story of my great-grandparents. These are the photos from my family, my great-grandparents. The family that originally lived in Cincinnati from 1890 to 1910. Looking at old photos is always very intriguing because they tell a different story. The actual account that I have from my great-grandparents, though, is very difficult to ascertain. And you look at these old photos and sometimes it just makes you feel like you're in a completely different world, as though you're looking at people with familiar faces, and yet the world they're living in just seems very different. This wasn't that long ago. Over 120 years, 130 years at most in some of the photos. And I just wanted to show you what these original photos looked like. This is the photo of my great-grandparents at their wedding ceremony. And they were very happy, according to what accounts that we have, although it's very difficult. And I'll explain why in a moment, why it's difficult to ascertain what truly happened. There was only a few surviving family members that actually made it to the generation, or 2 generations before mine, my grandparents. And there was quite a tragedy that occurred. From what I understand, when they were married, they were very happy, and they were prepared to take their place in life, and they lived in Cincinnati initially. And also the stories that my great-grandfather, pictured on the left here, was a very adventurous individual, and he was someone who had a very keen intellect, and wanted to find answers in his life. Apparently he was someone who didn't necessarily accept the answers that he was given by others, and searched on his own. There's accounts of them going to several different World's Fairs or World's Expositions, to include the Chicago World's Fair, the Cincinnati World's Fair, and finally the St. Louis World's Fair in the early 20th century. However, the records are very difficult, and it's hard to say exactly what happened. They settled on a farm in Kentucky near Cincinnati, and that seemed to be where they lived and enjoyed their initial life. Initially, they had 3 children, and then it increased to 5 children as they were running the typical farm. Here's where the story starts to take an ominous turn. For reasons unknown, my great-grandmother suddenly died, and it's difficult to ascertain exactly why she died. There's nothing stating sickness. There's rumors of post-childbirth difficulties and the usual health aspects of that time. But nobody seems to know for sure, and there's no written account or anything in the news that survived to this day that tells me exactly what happened. The story gets even stranger when the fact that my great-grandfather, an adventurous individual and someone who was reputed to be very reliable, and most of the members of my family, if not all, and all the descendants from this branch of the family, they were all about family, and all about going the extra distance to take care of family. Yet for some reason, my great-grandfather had all of his children taken away from him. There was nothing ever stated on an official reason for why this happened, why he would be unable to care for them, or why he'd be unable to move on. Subsequently, he was confined to the Central State Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, where he spent the last 3 decades of his life. These were the last pictures that were taken of him, and this is from the 1940s. I can't get an exact date on the photo. And it was supposedly from the time that my grandmother was able to visit him and took these photos, and you actually see Central State Hospital right behind him here. I do look at his face, and I see that he seems to be content or at ease. And there was once a letter that he had written to his children, and yet I can't find that letter. I only have memories of it from my grandmother and her surviving sisters, and most of them have passed away now. Still, I wonder, why were his children taken away? What really happened? I only have more questions than answers. And that was the unfortunate tragedy of how his life ended, and how my grandmother and her sisters were put on a later version of the Orphan train. The other thing that I found going through the photos was this strange postcard of the concourse at the Union Terminal in Cincinnati. You might recall it's the building we looked at in the exploration of Cincinnati that clearly inspired the Justice League building from the old Super Friends in the 1970s. Curious that this would be found in the effects that remained from my great-grandfather. This structure was not completed until the 1930s, and he was detained, and I'm going to use that word, in Central State Hospital in Louisville long before that. So why was there a postcard like this within his effects? It may not mean anything, but I have to wonder, is there some sort of clue about this? There's nothing that remains of his writings or his journals or even the letter that he wrote to his children after he was sent to Central State Hospital. So all I have to go on are clues, and I'm going to continue these explorations to try to find my own answers, because I feel there are many questions. We're also going to be looking more at the orphan trains, specific examples, and what effects they may have had from 1850 to 1870, and then their continuation in the 20th century. There's much more to explore with this, and yet it's clear we can see that this approach is still used even to this day with conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. It seems to be the way that people are kept in line, and that people are not only given activities which they must focus on, but also how people are controlled through conflict, through their role in society, and then ensuring that they adhere properly to their role in society. These are aspects we're going to continue to explore as we go forward. Welcome, and thank you for joining me for today's exploration into the mystery of incubator babies. We have many different rumors mixed with supposed facts about what happened in history, about the development of the incubator, and then the display of many babies in incubators at World's Fairs and on Coney Island. Today's exploration, we're going to be examining these accounts and trying to determine exactly what happened, along with potential theories on what's behind the mystery of the incubator children. Let's go back to the beginning and look at the problem of premature and congenitally ill infants, which we're told is not a new one. Now, I've gotten away from looking at Wikipedia articles on the channel, but in this case I'm going to make an exception because they have a pretty decent summary here. As early as the 17th and 18th centuries, there were scholarly papers published that attempted to share knowledge of interventions. It was not until 1922, however, that hospitals started grouping the newborn infants into one area, now called the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, NICU. Naturally, there's an acronym. Before the Industrial Revolution, premature and ill infants were born and cared for at home and either lived or died without medical intervention. In the mid-19th century, of course, when else would it be, the infant incubator was first developed based on the incubators used for chicken eggs. Dr. Stéphane Tarnier is generally considered to be the father of the incubator, or isolette as it is now known. First I've heard that term. having developed it to attempt to keep premature infants in a Paris maternity ward warm. Other methods had been used before, but this was the first closed model in addition. He helped convince other physicians that the treatment helped premature infants. France became a forerunner in assisting premature infants, in part due to its concerns about a falling birth rate. Interesting how we continuously hear about these concerns, and especially during that time frame. After Tarnier retired, Dr. Pierre Boudin followed in his footsteps, noting the limitations of infants in incubators and the importance of breast milk and the mother's attachment to the child. Well, I'm glad they noticed something that was so obvious. Boudin is known as the father of modern parentology. Oh, excuse me. Perinatology. There's all these great medical terms. I got to give them credit, though. They're a lot more creative than the architectural terms that we have. And what is perinatology? It is maternal fetal medicine. See, that's more of a descriptive term. And his seminal work, The Nursling, I'm not going to try it in French, became the first major publication to deal with the care of the neonate. Another factor that contributed to the development of modern neonatology was Dr. Martin Cooney and his permanent installment of premature babies in incubators at Coney Island. A more controversial figure, because what else would he be? He studied under Dr. Boudin and brought attention to premature babies and their plight through his display of infants as sideshow attractions at Coney Island and the World's Fair in New York and Chicago in 1933 and 1939, respectively. Infants had also previously been displayed in incubators at the 1897, 1898, 1901, and 1904 World's Fairs. So as you can see, we have something very suspicious going on here that warrants a deeper exploration. So now let's go to the Smithsonian Magazine, another one of our favorite, trusted, reputable sources of information, to look at the account of Martin Cooney. The man who ran a carnival attraction that saved thousands of premature babies wasn't a doctor at all. Martin Cooney carried a secret with him, but the results are unimpeachable. Oh, yes, it sounds so dramatic. Oh, and there's a picture of him right there, holding a child, premature baby who was on view at Coney Island attraction. An exhibition, no less. Nurses in starched white uniforms and doctors in medical coats tended to babies in glass and steel incubators. The infants had been born many weeks premature and well below a healthy birth rate. Stores didn't make clothes small enough to fit their tiny skeletal frames, so the nurses dressed them in dolls' clothes and knitted bonnets. A sign above the entrance read, "Living Babies in Incubators," in letters so large they could be read from the other end of the Chicago World's Fairgrounds, which took place over 18 months in 1933 and 1934. Always in Chicago, it seems. The infant incubator exhibit was built at a cost of $75,000, worth $1.4 million today, and was painted in patriotic red, white, and blue. And let's not forget what was going on in 1933 and 1934, the Great Depression, an event so terrible that Americans couldn't find work and people across the lands were suffering due to the economic depression, the Great Depression, of which has never been seen before or since. The men in charge were leading Chicago pediatrician Dr. Julius Hess and Martin Cooney, who was known across America as the Incubator Doctor. Cooney was a lugubrious man, and that's a word you don't see often, an adjective that's not typically used. Basically, it means he's sad or he appears sad. In his 60s, with thinning gray hair, a mustache, and a stoop, something he jokingly attributed to a lifetime of bending over babies. Of course, Cooney and Hess employed a team of 6 nurses and 2 wet nurses. Martin Cooney had run infant incubator exhibits in which premature babies were displayed to the public for more than 3 decades, most famously at Coney Island in New York City. He had long been regarded by desperate parents as a savior, one who offered medical help to babies written off as weaklings by mainstream medicine. Little side note here, it should be noted that eugenics was really coming into the forefront, supposedly, in the early 20th century. And there were many doctors and part of the mainstream medical establishment, if there is such a thing, that stated that a lot of these infants should simply be left to die, because if they were allowed to live, it would weaken the species. No, this did not start in the 1940s with that terrifying regime that we hear so much about. This mentality started well before that. That's where that terrifying regime supposedly got the ideas. But who knows what the truth is? That's what we're told. But for Hess, who was accustomed to carrying out his work in a more conventional hospital setting, this was a career first. The exhibit was a hit with the Chicago public, who paid 25 cents and flocked by the hundreds of thousands to see the babies. Why is that, one wonders? To celebrate the success of their facility, Cooney organized a homecoming celebration on July 25, 1934, for babies who had graduated from the incubators at the Chicago's World's Fair the previous summer. Of the 58 babies Cooney and Hess had cared for in 1933, 41 returned with their mothers for the reunion. The event was broadcast live on local radio and across the fairgrounds. Well, of course it was. On the radio program, Cooney's exhibit was portrayed by the announcer not as a frivolous sideshow spectacle, but as an invaluable medical facility. The incubator station for premature babies is not primarily a place of exhibiting tiny infants. Instead, it is actually a life-saving station where prematurely born babies are brought from leading hospitals all over the city, just for the care and attention that are afforded. The place is spick and span, with doctors and graduate nurses in constant attendance. Interesting, almost sounds like a commercial for White Castle. Because of the sideshow setting in which he operated, Cooney's career had always been controversial. Well, of course it is. An effective doctor? That's naturally controversial. Many in the medical professional, interesting, viewed the incubator doctor with suspicion, others with outright hostility. Wonder why. The New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children had repeatedly accused Cooney of exploiting the babies and endangering their lives by putting them on show. And is this the same New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children that advocated eugenics? It's a discussion for another time. None of the complaints was sustained. Who wrote this? And by the 1930s, Cooney was finally being taken seriously as a medical pioneer. Cooney's professional collaboration with Hess marked a key stage in his habilitation. But while doing research for my radio documentary, Life Under Glass, which is being broadcast on NPR stations around the country this August, and my book, Miracle at Coney Island, I made an incredible discovery about a man who has a claim to have changed the course of American neonatal medicine. Here it comes. Cooney was never actually qualified as a medical doctor. Throughout his career, Cooney said he had studied medicine in Leipzig and Berlin. However, I could find no evidence of Cooney, or Cohen as he was known then, having studied medicine at a university in either city. Wonder why this is. To become a physician in Germany, one was required to write a thesis. Things haven't changed that much at all, have they? The U.S. National Library of Medicine has copies of the German records. Librarians could not locate a thesis written by Cooney. It's obvious it couldn't have been lost or anything like that. No, that possibility doesn't even cross the mind. Cooney was deliberately evasive about his date and place of birth. I have discovered that he immigrated to the U.S. in 1888 at 19 years old. And what evidence? Never mind. I'll stop asking questions. But someone at that age would not be old enough to have studied at university in Leipzig and Berlin before going on to do graduate work in Paris at the knee of Pierre Boudin. Funny way to say it. The father of European neonatal medicine, as Cooney claimed to have done in numerous press interviews. In the 1910 U.S. Census, Cooney listed his career as surgical instruments, though Cooney claimed to be the inventor of an incubator. I have been unable to find any evidence that he registered an incubator patent in the U.S. More likely, Cooney was a technician, yet by 1930 he was describing himself in the census as a physician. Oh, you imposter. Over time, the success of Cooney's facility began to attract the attention of some of America's leading pediatricians. Right up until the late 1930s, few American hospitals had incubators, so doctors sent premature babies to him. Very interesting accounts. Cooney took in babies from all backgrounds, regardless of race or social class, a remarkably progressive policy, especially when he started out. He did not take a penny from the parents of the babies. In 1903, it cost around $15, equivalent to around $405 today, to care for each baby. Cooney covered all the costs through the entrance fees. Why not? Presumably unaware that Cooney was not a qualified doctor, pediatricians began coming to the fairgrounds to collaborate with Cooney and study the babies in his care. And yet none of these qualified pediatricians were able to figure out that Cooney was not really a doctor. Fascinating. The distinguished Yale professor, pediatrician, and child development psychologist Arnold Gesell visited Cooney multiple times at the 1939 New York World's Fair. Gesell brought a cameraman with him to film the babies in Cooney's facility. Interestingly, when Gesell wrote his book, The Embryology of Behavior, The Beginnings of the Human Mind, he avoided any mention of Cooney or the sideshow setting where he had carried out much of his research. By contrast, when in 1922 Hess wrote the first textbook on premature birth published in the U.S., Premature and Congenitally Diseased Infants, he wrote, I desire to acknowledge my indebtedness to Dr. Martin Cooney. Of all Cooney's professional associations, his friendship with Morris Fishbein, the controversial president, what else would it be, of the American Medical Association, no, those are two things you don't see side to side very often, if ever, is the most intriguing. Fishbein was the head of the AMA for 25 years and led the association's crusade against quack doctors. The two men were so close, Fishbein sent his aspiring medic son, Justin, to discuss his career with Cooney in New York. If he had been found out, Cooney could have faced a large fine and a lengthy prison sentence. Over the course of his nearly 50-year career, Cooney took in around 8,000 babies, of whom he claimed to have saved around 6,500. While there's no way of verifying the numbers, pediatricians today acknowledge that the team of doctors and nurses which Cooney assembled was highly skilled, ensuring the babies got the best care available in America at that time. Well, very interesting, and very interesting article overall. Now, let's get to the good part since we've looked at the baseline of what the mainstream tells us, and let's consider what's really going on with these incubator babies. What's really going on with this story? Why do we have all this attention on Dr. Cooney, and why did we review this article? We know that there are pieces of information that seem to be fact in the article, and what it seems to be happening is that Dr. Cooney is a lightning rod to draw our attention. Yet other pieces of information seem to be fact. The fact that there were numerous exhibitions for decades that showed these incubator babies. The fact that there seemed to be medical teams all across the country, because supposedly everybody who had a premature birth had to go through Dr. Cooney. There was nobody else. How does that make any sense? This is what we'd expect to see at the World's Fair exhibition, but this is what we actually see. Not a single incubator, but many incubators. Why do we see so many incubators when 1, 2, or 3 would be perfectly sufficient to showcase the capabilities of the equipment? Now, of course, we cover this by saying we want to show off babies. But that's the reality. They're not showing off the incubators. It's clear they're showing off the babies. Why are they showing off the babies? If you think about that and you think about what you see in this image, there are many infants and many incubators there for this little crowd of people to see. And it looks like we have a doctor who's given an overall account of what's going on to this little tour group, if you will. And we even see what appears to be a child there. What's the real story with these children? There's even accounts that there was a fire that endangered many of the babies, although they saved them all in the incubators at one of the World's Fairs in the 19-teens. And yet this didn't stop Dr. Cooney from doing this. What's the real situation with this? And why is this so ominous? The reality that there was a supposed labor shortage, especially in the Midwest of the United States, in the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. If that's true, then it seems there wasn't sufficient population to consider settling the rest of the United States. So what if these incubator babies are really babies that had been produced? And then that leads to additional questions. Well, where did these babies come from? And how were they able to bring so many of them in so quickly? It goes back to many different questions about the fact that we have photographic evidence that makes it very clear that they're not showcasing the incubators. They're showcasing the babies. And what was the true number of orphan train riders? We're told it's 250,000. Yet there seem to be indications that since it went on for so long, the number had to be much greater. What if there's a disparity in the number of babies who were in the incubators? We're told the number is 6,000, 8,000, but the article admits there's no way to know. Yet supposedly this was across the entire nation, this appeared in multiple world fairs, and this went on for decades. Do we really believe that number would only be 6,000 or 8,000, or could it be far more? Consider the original concept behind the incubator. They tell us that it was started and invented in the 19th century, and that prior to that, there was no way to care or save infants who were born prematurely. Well, was that its real intention? Or were these infants somehow produced in some areas that we don't know of, or areas that remain secret to the general population? And then they were provided or transported to all of these locations at these World's Fairs and locations across what is now the United States for display and exhibition. Everyone always refers to the incubator babies of Coney Island, but it very much was not simply Coney Island. What exactly is that individual wearing right there? That does not seem like the attire I would expect to see somebody wearing in New York in the 19th, early 20th century. But perhaps one of you historians out there could correct me on what the proper attire was. It's an interesting picture, and it looks like we have 3 infants in that particular incubator. So what exactly is going on with that? Regardless, we understand that these incubators were everywhere. They were displayed everywhere. And there also seemed to be a lot of effort put into this. I also find it interesting that the sign here is a little bit more elaborate than what we typically see. And why does this picture seem strange? The actions of the people that are posing in this picture, and even the appearance of some of these people in this picture. Supposedly this is from the early 1900s. Based on the era of dress, that's what we'd think, and those are more the hats I would expect to see in the United States. Either the top hat, or the classic version of the Panama hat, or even the little exhibition or the Expedition Smokey Bear hat. What exactly are we looking at? The gentleman, I think, who's holding the baby looks really strange. And then back on the sign itself, there seemed to be a lot of effort put into advertising this. And of course, you don't just see incubators. They weren't showcasing the equipment. They were showcasing the babies with the living infants. It seems as though this was designed to provide a selection or another alternative for labor and for repopulation. And we have many pictures like this. If these were the original mothers of these children, why would they ever allow them to be displayed like this? Even if Dr. Cooney had saved them. It just doesn't seem to match what we know of basic human social activity, or the bond between a mother and the child. This almost seems like these are people who came and they were looking for children to pick up. They picked out their children, and then they adopted them. We look at the many postcards and the images of the Cabbage Patch. And what's really the origin behind that? We're told that this is because people were uncomfortable about talking about such things as human reproduction in the 19th and the early 20th century, and so they used the Cabbage Patch and the stork to explain it. However, it seems as though there's a much more ominous meaning behind it. The reality behind the Cabbage Patch, that this was a way that they were simply providing children when they needed to repopulate the area. And that the true process was a family, a couple, or who knows, perhaps even people who hadn't even gotten married yet, went around, looked at children in the incubators, and selected them. And this image is especially ominous because here we have the children riding on a train. All the symbolism being depicted in this postcard. It seems like it's very benign and joyful. However, when we look at it for what it truly represents and what it could represent, it takes on a very different meaning. The great difficulty in accepting the fact that this could be the reality of the existence of many lineages. And none of us wanted to accept that or even consider it. But what if it's even more ominous that they were redesigning humans? We have far too many accounts of giants in our history and our myth, and supposedly some have even claimed to have discovered giants' bones, although these finds are always contested and considered quote-unquote pseudoscience. And yet there's many historical records beyond myth of giants. Even Roman Emperor Maximinus Thrax, who was a historical figure, and based on the actual conversion of the Roman measurement, he would be 8 feet 6 inches tall. And that's not beyond the realm of consideration because we have had human beings that have gotten over 8 feet tall that have been documented. Yet other evidence exists for even larger human beings. So what if the children from these incubators were redesigned human beings, either with some sort of process concerning DNA or some sort of scientific process that we don't understand? Also consider that in the Bible, the decline in ages at death. You look far enough back in the Bible, and other religious texts, of course, and it seems there are well-documented cases of human beings living over 800 years. Yet as time went on, for some reason, the lifespan or life expectancy decreased immensely, down to 200 years. And what can we say it is now? 80? 85 if you're lucky. Depending where you live, of course, we'll be told that there's a different life expectancy depending on nation, although what that has to do with it, I'm not sure. Yet that's what we're told. But what if the real answer, the potential changes in our human structure and our human lifespan, have to do with the actual redesigning of the human being? Perhaps through some process of alchemy that we don't understand, or some other scientific process that we're never going to be allowed to understand. It's a chilling consideration, and it's one of the reasons that this is a difficult topic to cover. Yet we have a lot of evidence and a lot of accounts that indicate this may be the case. Think of the channel's exploration into the underground. When we think of the existing population of the civilization that came before ours, Tartaria, or call it whatever you want to, and the many bones that we have underground indicating that millions were killed. Somebody died down there, and then somebody arranged the bones like that, indicating there was some mass killing that occurred. We have many difficult terms for it now. And then we also consider the images that we have of different types of humans or human-like creatures, such as the blimmies. Were they the result of some sort of genetic manipulation or tampering or alteration? And then, of course, there are many other creatures. And then we wonder even about the very plain disparity that we have in human beings today. Compared to this, the differences in human beings today is very, very minor. Also, when you take accounts in of other creatures that supposedly existed. Also, going back to the giants, here's Robert Wadlow from Alton, Illinois. Guinness Book of World Records is the tallest human being. The picture in the middle, some people contest saying it's fake, and yet that individual who appears to be in that coffin looks about to be as tall as Robert Wadlow. And then what about the skeleton to the right? Is that real, or is that an altered image? Things suddenly become a lot more cloudy when we consider this, and we consider these conflicting accounts. Robert Wadlow was very well documented. What about the rest of this? What about the myths and the stories that we have of different human beings in the past? And what about the myths and the stories that we have of giants and of people having much longer lifespans? There's too many accounts of this to simply ignore. Of course, our mainstream will address this by saying that no, everything we tell you is true. There were dinosaurs 65 million years ago, and that's not absurd. And yes, they were tremendously large creatures, and they lived on the land. So we can't use that old excuse that, well, we only have large creatures in the water, such as the blue whale, because that facilitates large creatures in the water. But we'll justify this by saying things were very different in the environment, and that's what facilitated the lifespan of large creatures such as these, with the size and mass that you couldn't possibly imagine. And isn't it funny how much we remember in school the way that they push dinosaurs on us, and even in fiction to this day, and science fiction being mixed with it. And we'll be told that this is a picture of an individual next to a dinosaur bone. But are we sure it's a dinosaur bone, or could that be a bone of anything, or could it be something else entirely? Remember that we just have a picture here. So what does this really tell us about these incubator babies? It seems clear that there was some more nefarious purpose by displaying all of these infants in all these different locations. Were they just displaying infants that you could select as part of a repopulation plan at a national or potentially international level? Who knows how widespread this was? Or were they introducing an altered human being into the existing population stocks? Can't really disprove that. Can't really prove it either. However, they're very interesting considerations. What do you think is really going on? Let me know in the comments. We're going to continue this exploration, and we're going to try to answer the questions, whether it's through theory and conjecture based on available evidence, of how the situation came to be. Where did these babies come from? Where did the orphans on the orphan trains come from? And how did we end up in this situation after the last reset, whether it occurred in 1850 or a year that was much earlier? There's much more exploration that we have to complete, and we will, with the 19th century and understanding how the situation came to be and looking for explanations of what happened to the civilization before us and how the reset was so effective.